Welcome to this adult education session, a series of 5 sessions, and I will, a little further on here in the introduction, draw your attention to the dates, because we are skipping the first Sunday in February because of the Bible Bowl, and then returning, but I will remind you of that. So it's 4, skip a Sunday, and then we return for the conclusion. Does everybody have a blue sheet? Okay. That one, you win the door prize if you have that one. I don't know how it got in. I don't know how that got in. They're all blue except for one. So the office must have been in the process of changing paper somewhere in the run. Okay, for those of you who may not know me, I'm Jim Aageson, and it seems as though it's become kind of a pattern that I plug into the adult education series during the season of Epiphany. I don't know that this will be a revelation or a manifestation of some sort of divine grace, but we can always hope, right? I would like to begin with a little bit of context. Those of you who have been here the last 2 years during these Epiphany courses, you may remember that 2 years ago I taught a course entitled "A Christian Thinks About Islam and the Quran." And last year I taught a course, "A Christian Thinks About Jews and Judaism, Anti-Semitism in the Land of Israel." I guess I was prompted to do these two because I have always appreciated here at St. Andrew during the prayers that we pray for our interfaith partners. And now, I assure you, even though I, for 30 years, was a professor of religions of the Middle East, there are people who know a whole lot more about Islam and the Quran than I do. But I may be as good as it gets in-house here. I've spent a lot more time thinking about Judaism, especially ancient Judaism. But we were all thrown a very tragic curveball between my preparation of this course and then what happened a year ago on October 7th. And I simply remind you that in that course, I was arguing explicitly and implicitly that when we think about contemporary Judaism in the Middle East, when we think about anti-Semitism and the land of Israel, we need a kind of double consciousness. On the one hand, historic Christianity's complicity in anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which we will all, I hope, renounce over and over and over again, and at the same time stand for justice for Palestinian people and their rights. And that is a tough double consciousness often to manifest and represent in a highly polarized Middle East. Okay, that's the past. I have been fussing about, in my own head anyway, and in my reading, about the present cultural moment in the United States, and not just the United States, about what is sometimes referred to as, incorrectly perhaps, political populism, authoritarianism, et cetera, et cetera. You can fill in all the words you might want. And it's really complicated, but we could think about our cultural moment economically, we could think about it politically, but we can think about it religiously as well. And last winter, I read the opening article, the cover article in the Atlantic Monthly magazine by Tim Alberta, where he describes having grown up in an evangelical church and where his father, a later convert in life, was the pastor outside of Detroit. And he was not only perplexed, but troubled by what he saw in his father and in his home church, the church where he grew up. And he's a journalist, a staff writer for The Atlantic, and a very well-respected journalist. I thought, I have to get his book. The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. Now, it's how should I say it? A complicated book that is at once revealing but depressing. It occurred to me when I got the invitation to do something this Epiphany that maybe we could, or I could devise a way for us to be drawn into this world as we think about our moment in history in this country and the cultural phenomenon that sometimes perplexes us. While doing that, I thought, we can't just reduce this cultural moment, religiously speaking, to just one approach, one thing. And so I have put together, in addition to this set of presentations, 2 more. If you're really unlucky, you might get to hear them at some point in the future. The second one is what I've entitled The Faithful Middle, Lutheran Theology in a Polarized Extremist World. Does our tradition have anything to contribute to the way we think about extremism? Or do we simply get sucked along with everybody else, politically, religiously? And while working on that, I came upon another book. See, that's what people like me do. We read books. And I've entitled this presentation, I have no idea where this will ever be given, but The Changing North American Church. Thoughts and reflections looking back and forward. And it was prompted by a book entitled The Great De-Churching. My wife hates that word, but that's the title of the book, De-Churching. Written by 2 evangelical pastors in Orlando, Florida, who don't fit well into what Tim Alberta finds. These people are serious folks, and they're doing, in conjunction with a political scientist, what has happened to the American church in the last 25 years. Mainline Protestant, Catholic, and evangelical. 40 million people who once attended church do not any longer attend. And they want to know why. If you want to read this book, it's interesting. But we understand the church is changing. So, here we are, at least in my thinking about 3 different approaches to that question. What about our current moment culturally from a religious point of view? Liz?
Just a quick question. You said in America. What about in Europe and the rest of the world?
Yes. They focus in this book on the United States. They allude to the fact that Northern and Western Europe in particular have de-churched long before. And a whole body of study and literature has been presented dealing with the shift in global Christianity from the Northern Hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, to the South and to the East. It has, if you were to look at statistics from 1900 to the year 2000 in terms of what has happened, in terms of the growth of the church in Africa, it is stunning. Asia as well, South Asia and South America also. We in the Northern Hemisphere are not the kind of global center of Christianity any longer. The South is sending missionaries to the United States. Bonnie.
Are we talking specifically about attendance or philosophy and daily life?
Both. Are we talking about attendance, which you can quantify in many ways, statistically, or daily life? Yes and yes. There are places in Africa that live in a culture, a rural culture, a community life, social life, that is much closer to the Bible than anything we recognize in North America, in our industrialized, urbanized world. Okay, I thought that might just be a helpful kind of introductory context about where we have been and what I'm thinking about. And this set of presentations and classes really deal with the first of those, extremism, the heresy and its consequences. I don't want to quibble over words, but I do need to take a moment to think about extremism. Often in our political dialogue in this country, having come through a political season, extremism is a word that we assign to people for political value, people who hold ideas and views different than our own. They may not be on the margins of anything, but if you label them extremist, there's perceived to be some political value in that. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. The second term is heresy. Pastor Aageson, in her announcement this morning, said she appreciated the use of the term. I use the term advisedly because it can be misused as well. If you don't agree with me, you must be heretical. Well, not necessarily. So, we have to keep that in mind. The description. How do we untie the Gordian knot? Are you all familiar with that term? Okay. There's a legend that goes back centuries into BC that in West Central Asia Minor, in the city of Gordian, there was a rope that tied an ox cart to the town, Gordian. And it was tied in such a complicated way that the legend says anybody who could untie this knot would control all of Asia. 4th century BC, Alexander the Great comes from Macedonia into Asia Minor, Turkey, for us today, and he can't untie the knot. So what does he do? He sharpens his sword and splits it. Now, It's legendary, but it is a term that we sometimes use to think about untying or solving complicated, if not unsolvable, problems. How do we untie the Gordian knot regarding the relationship between extremist religion and national politics? So this does follow on Pastor Allison's earlier class. We might state the problem this way. Religion and politics should remain separate because they have the potential to corrupt each other. Religion and politics cannot remain separate because people's fundamental values will and ought to inform the social and political order. But what happens when extremist religion, right-wing Christianity in this case, and extremist politics, extremist right-wing American politics in this case, join hands? This is the world that Tim Alberta leads us into in his recent book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicalism in an Age of Extremism. And I want to state right at the outset, as with the case in my presentations having to do with Islam and Judaism, I'm an outsider. I'm not an evangelical in the sense that he's using it here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Even though those of us who belong to this church are part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And when you're always speaking as an outsider, there has to be a modicum of humility, I think. And I also think that when we use that term evangelical, it's a grand generalization. I have a lot of evangelical friends who theologically we're closer than one might think, and who are not the kind of operations that Tim Alberta writes about. And I want to say that up front and be respectful about that. We will follow Alberta into this world in order to examine this contemporary Christian heresy and its many, many consequences. Okay. I make this promise to myself and to you, every class. I will repeat the questions. I enlist your support. At this age, my memory often is short. Should we pause? Any observations or questions as we pause for a moment? Yes?
Extremism is certainly like such a politically charged term, like you said, but what does it actually mean?
Yes. I will say a little bit more directly about this a little later. What does the word extremism actually mean? It's a highly charged word. Just for this moment, I think we can say that it represents a position on the margins of something, maybe beyond the margins. And so in the political realm, you could have those who refer to Bernie Sanders as an extremist on the left, and you might have Steve Bannon referred to as an extremist on the right. So it can cut in different ways, but you're on the margins, or you're portrayed to be on the margins. I will say a little bit more about it. Now, these 7 sessions here, let's just look at this a bit to see where we're going, are not divided, obviously, session by session. We're going to just work our way through this. I know that when I put a date down for each of these, we're going to get off out of sync. And I can't always predict that. But today I want to spend a little bit of time, Roman numeral 1, on the wider context through which to read the kingdom, the power, and the glory. I want to spend some time giving you some information with regard to global religious extremism as a lens through which to think about Alberta's book and our situation. Number 2, we may get there today. I'd like to spend a little time thinking about Tim Alberta, his father, and the warping of Christianity in contemporary American politics. Tim Alberta grew up in an evangelical church. And what prompts this, in addition to his editor at The Atlantic, Jeff Goldberg, a Jewish fellow, saying, Tim, you've got to write this book about evangelical Christianity. And he begins by writing it from his own personal experience with his home church, as I said before, and his father. And his wife, at a point in there, says, Tim, what in the hell has happened to us? Okay, this is existential for him. He's still a Christian. I think he would still identify as an evangelical Christian. But he can't quite believe what he sees. Then Roman numeral 3, it'll be down the road. I can't deal with everything in these sessions that he writes about, but it is really revealing for those of us of a certain age to go back and rethink Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, and the cult of personality and the fall. Roman numeral 4, Greg Locke and the Global Vision Bible Church, the Kingdom Builders. And then 5, Orthodox monk Cyril Hoverin, civil religion and political religion, the point and counterpoint of American extremist religion and Russian religion in the time of Putin. There are some similarities. 6, Seeing the Light, the reconversion of Brian Zant and the courage to push back. It's an interesting story. And I will draw out from each of these sections some observations, some ideas. I will even do, on his Tim Alberta's behalf, some book reading to see, in his own words, what's going on. And finally, number 7. This may seem a little bit odd to you, but I think in all of this, we need to think about Christian freedom and American freedom. Freedom is a big word in our cultural vocabulary, and it has political implications, constitutional implications, and it also has religious implications. Freedom is bandied about just about like the word love was in the 1960s. But what in the world does it mean? And how to think about it? Tim Snyder, I think he grew up as a Christian. He may still be. He teaches history at Yale. And he recently wrote this book on freedom. And I could not help but think that in the beginning of this book, he is not also drawing on a Christian notion of freedom, the way he describes this. And that's why on the back of the syllabus, I went back and looked again at Martin Luther's The Freedom of a Christian, and John Barclay's Slaves to One Another. Paul's letters probe the paradox of freedom through love. John Barclay is writing specifically about the church. Tim Alberta is writing more broadly about how we might think about freedom in the richest and fullest sense. And I think they overlap. And in Alberta's book, there is a lot of discussion about some of these very marginal groups that talk about freedom. You and I might not recognize it as freedom. Okay. I simply put this bibliography for anybody who wants to read this or that. I know some of you may have read Tim Alberta's book or are reading it. If you do, wonderful. But my job is to kind of get us into his world a bit. Any comments or questions or concerns? Okay, religious extremism, the wider context. Very recently, a great deal of attention has been given to the issues of religious violence, the rise of religious fundamentalism, friction between global religions, and the character of human freedom. We might think, for example, in an extreme sense, about Mark Juergensmeyer's book, Terror in the Mind of God, Religious Violence. And he looks at it globally. I used to teach a global studies course on the Middle East, and I used Mark's book. Another book that I have used over the years is Strong Religion, The Rise of Fundamentalism Around the World. Fundamentalism, as it has reemerged in the United States, is not an isolated case. And then, Eliza Griswold's book, The 10th Parallel. Her father was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. She's a journalist. And it is a fascinating book because she looks at the 10th parallel as a band on either side around the globe. And what happens in spades in that band? Islam and Christianity confront each other. And the violence that erupts across the continent of Africa, in the Philippines, and a couple of other places as well. It is where, Liz, we might find in the Christian community theologically considerable conservatism. The Roman Catholic Church runs up against that. Has anybody seen the movie Conclave? You see in this projected election of a new pope how the Catholic Church in its universality is affected. Third world, developing world, Italy, Russia, by these kinds of things. While the word extremism has a relativistic quality about it, it connotes, certainly in common parlance, that which is thought to take place on the margins of what is considered to be normal, common, or traditional. It may also suggest something that can be violent in the service of some larger truth. While Timothy Snyder's work is not specifically about extremism, he argues for a richer notion, as I said, of freedom. And the distinction he makes is that we often focus on a very limited, not unimportant, but a very limited notion of freedom from something. It's freedom from. Freedom from external control, freedom from bondage, freedom from depression, freedom from substance abuse and addiction, all that. And he says, hey, wait a minute. We need to think positively about freedom to, or I might say, freedom for something. What are the values, the virtues, and the things that represent freedom? And here I think the church has a lot to say, and I think in our larger culture we need to think about that too. Freedom to represent the values and virtues, and he works that out. You can read Galatians 5. It is under this larger canopy then that Tim Alberta, staff writer, reports on extremism in among American evangelicals. And it is here where this Gordian knot, I think, comes to the fore. Alberta does not presume to know how to untie this thorny knot. But he does give us an up-close and personal look at many of the manifestations going on out there. Manifestations in his tradition of American evangelicalism and their extremist tendencies. He does so, he also brings into sharp relief certain brands of Christianity and the way certain politics merge and interact. Now, it would be easy, and I'm guilty of this too, to say, how could somebody in their right mind vote this way or that way? I think that doesn't get us very far. I don't think it's all irrational. It isn't we the rational and they the irrational. With his help, we can see some of the forces, if not the logic, I think, that inform and drive this extremism both in the religious and political realms. Okay, I think we need to try to understand. And before we turn specifically to Alberta's book, it will be helpful to learn from other scholars about the characteristics of religious movements more broadly. This will provide a lens, then, I think, that will help us think about Tim Alberta's book. From a social point of view, extreme fundamentalist groups often exhibit what can be described as an enclave mentality. An enclave is, we hunker down in our world to protect ourselves from those on the outside. They see themselves as separated from the larger culture, perhaps even as a community in exile from the seductive, evil, secular culture that threatens to pollute the community. Some of us are old enough in here to remember the revolution in Iran, from the Shah to the Ayatollah. We can see this going on right now, not only in places like Iran, but in Russia. They look at the West as in total moral decay. And self-interested imperialists. You see that going on in this country, too, in certain religious groups who choose to withdraw. That's not particularly a new phenomenon. It went on in Europe as well, with certain groups who chose to withdraw. I grew up in Montana. There are Hutterite colonies everywhere. Mennonites have their way of dealing with this. Other groups, likewise. When these people look to a larger modernist world, they see a culture of pleasure-seeking and self-destructive behavior that can only be described as a kind of secular humanism where individual appetites seek satisfaction at all cost. Now, I don't consider myself an enclavist in that sense, except when I go to a movie theater and see many of the previews. Anybody else have that experience? I can't bring myself to do it, but I need to go late. Distinctions are blurred. Gender distinctions are blurred, for example. Clear boundaries melt away between right and wrong, and God and God's will are largely ignored from that enclave point of view. It's interesting. Putin's Russia, seemingly in not only the present, but in the Soviet era as well, needed a scapegoat, has needed a scapegoat. For a long time, it was the Jews. Not anymore. It's LBGTQ people. Enclave Protestants see people drifting away from the church, 40 million, to what is often described as secular humanism. And even those who stay can best be described as lukewarm from that point of view. In response to the enclave community sets up recognizable boundaries to protect itself from the alluring temptations of the larger community. As has been described, the morally superior enclave community sets around itself a wall of virtue, and it seeks to preserve itself from the temptations of the world outside. This is anecdotal. Julie has a sister and a brother-in-law who live in Olympia. Last spring, or late last winter, they were visiting with somebody who had been invited to a church for some other reason, not just to go to church, but for some reason, and I don't remember what that was, in Chehalis or Kelso, down there, southwest Washington. And he went into the church in the narthex, and you know what he saw? He saw a cross. And hanging over the cross was an AR-15. I mean, this isn't that far away. Now, how do you get there? For the people of the enclave, this secular humanism and compromising with it is what has gotten into the fix they think we are in. religious, or shall we say Christian clarity is needed at all cost, especially as the moral pollution of the larger society laps at our door. Given what is at stake, no one can dare sit on the fence. However, despite the moral decay all around us, Christian civilization can still be turned around and made great again. Sound familiar? That is provided the Bible and prayer get back into the public schools, and the Ten Commandments are prominently displayed in public places. Many of you know we spend our summer months in Montana. I invite you to come over there and see what you see. Everywhere, almost everywhere, on cars, on billboards, stickers here and there, is this uniform logo representing the Ten Commandments. And then if that isn't enough to get your attention, and we know this goes on around the whole country, we need to get the Ten Commandments as though it's going to do something for us, really. I suppose it has to do with Christian morality. Then if you go a little closer to our place, you come to this, what do I call it? A shrine to civil American religion. It's open for business, and they invite people to come in, and you see a whole large semicircle of billboards having to do with the commandments and statements from founders of this country. Thomas Jefferson, of course, he wasn't exactly a Christian, but that doesn't matter. And it all has to do with a kind of morality, civil religion, as though, the Christian civilization is overlaid, or vice versa, with American civilization. There isn't much room, if any, between them. Now, you can see, I think, how that can easily slip into Christian nationalism, restoring Christian civilization, and they know you're not going to roll this country back in terms of the demography. We're too diverse. But they're going to fight back against that with everything they've got. And probably not just Christian nationalism writ large, but anti-Semitism at the core as well. Anti-Islamic tendencies, clearly. And American civilization is, from that point of view, perceived to look like them or us. This is a Christian country, after all, as if a country can be Christian. India. Oh, yes, clearly misogynistic, too. Yeah. Clearly misogynistic. And that makes foreign immigration into this larger society a problem, especially when the doors are open to people who are different. And this plays itself out in certain Muslim countries, too, where Sharia law is concerned. So these phenomena are not just limited to Christians. They can manifest themselves in other ways. And who knows what's going on in Israel right now. In these kinds of enclave communities, the issue of authority is crucial. Beyond the authority of the text, Scripture, there are the people who lead these communities, the authoritative figures. Sometimes the leadership is a small group of men, but perhaps more often a single person. Now, occasionally, a woman will kind of sneak in there, but not usually. In most cases, women need not apply. Sometimes the leader has formal training, but the most crucial factor is charisma. Charisma. And as we'll see when we get into Tim Alberta's book more closely, we all know this is true in most cases, but pastors of many of these churches will come there and they will stay for decades. They will stay until they either die or fall from grace. We in the ELCA and most mainline Protestant, we rotate pastors around. So it's more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to have the pastor create his or her kingdom. The seat of authority is thought to be in the community, the congregation, and so on and so forth. Okay. In the United States, many of these churches then end up being mega churches. Richard, I know you're reading Tim Alberta's book. Some of these operations are big businesses, have a lot of money, wealth, using the latest technology, often willing to preach the prosperity gospel, namely, if you have enough faith, you're going to prosper. To which good middle class and upper middle class people gravitate. It can in some cases be a strange mix of boundary building, apocalyptic conservatism, material prosperity, and world affirming and world denying all at the same time. Someplace in there, in the book, he will say, after he's given you all these examples of these churches, and we'll see the case of Brian's on, where he starts this church, as a 20-year-old, and he turns it into a huge business, mega church. Everything is rolling along really well until one day he looks at himself and he says, there's something wrong with this. And he doesn't come out right away, but when he does, everybody flees. And when Tim Alberta goes to that church for a Sunday morning worship, he comes in, drives in, and there's this huge parking lot and a handful of cars. And he thinks, they must have several services, or I'm in the wrong place or something. He goes in there. This auditorium seats hundreds and hundreds, and there are a handful of people there. And that's what's happened. He gleans from this the idea then that people are sitting in the pews not to be challenged, but to have their own views endorsed. And when the pastor no longer endorses their own preconceived theology or notions, they're gone. They'll find the church down the road that will. Okay. In this world of an enclave, you know your place, where you fit, and how you must act. It is in this world that the notion of religious martyrdom, also a well-known phenomenon from early Christianity and in some contemporary forms of Islam, fits. The willingness to die for an idea or belief is thought to be the ultimate form of faithfulness. A form of faithfulness where heavenly glory will welcome the martyr on the side of a noble death. And the family and friends left behind are often buoyed and even revered because of their hero's death. Indeed, one's own position in the local community can be enhanced. The part of the world where religious extremism and violence may be most persistent, even endemic, however, is this so-called 10th parallel around the globe, where Muslims and Christians butt up against each other, trying to push each other back by conversion or whatever. Very often, little opportunity for reconciliation between them. Okay. The kinds of evangelical extremism that Tim Alberta documents in his book rarely, if ever, descend into this kind of violence, even though in a general sense they may exhibit certain similarities. We saw some of this decades ago now with regard to the anti-abortion movement. There was even a Lutheran pastor who engaged in violence. I don't think it was LCA, ALC, or ELCA, but. And so I think the way we need to think about this is that there is a continuum in the ways religious people engage their larger societies and the political orders in which they live. There's a continuum here. It's a kind of spectrum disorder. Or order. From absolute and strict separation on the one hand of religion and politics, on the one end, we might think of Ron Reagan. Has he been on TV lately? But he periodically appears. And he informs us that he's not afraid of burning in hell. And then, to the great cosmic struggle between good and evil, a good and evil world that must be violently combated at every turn on the other end of the extreme, religious terrorists. For all the differences that undoubtedly exist among different religious groups on the extremist end of the continuum, at least some of the differences are matters of degree. The one thing that places them all on this continuum is the way people's own religious beliefs and convictions, or absence thereof, cause them to engage the state or the larger society. It's kind of a slide rule of some sort here, where you position yourselves. The thing that moves them along this slide rule, this continuum from one end to the other, is the degree to which people think the state ought to be influenced or controlled by their own personal religious or philosophical viewpoints. Their beliefs, their ethics. Abortion violence. I guess it was the Lutheran minister Michael Bray. Was he Missouri Synod maybe? Anti-abortion. Convicted of committing and intending to commit violent acts against women's health groups. This was way back in the 1980s. In our current social climate in this country today, we can see how these things play themselves out religiously and politically. We can think politically of the urban-rural divides in our culture, the divides among people with different levels of education, the divides between more progressive religious folks and people with more traditional and fundamentalist religious perspectives. And the fear and frenzy around immigration, especially by people who do not look like us and who may practice different religious traditions than our own. And this, you might, who know this better than I do, correct me, but this goes back to the 1960s when we changed our immigration laws to make it possible for people from various corners of the world to immigrate. At the root, much of this is the way we choose to deal with pluralism, difference, and change. Well, change can be difficult. Indeed, it can. It is also inevitable. And if we have the good fortune to live long enough, we'll go through various phases of change. At the moment, one of the things that has exacerbated this, it seems to me, both religiously and more broadly, is the rate of change. I remember, Gretchen?
How much of this do you think is based on a basic fear of change?
Oh, exactly. Fear if you can make people afraid, even more afraid than they would normally be, they're much easier to control and manipulate. I don't think there's any question about that. I think that's true. I remember some years ago, you might be familiar with the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman. I always kind of have kept an eye on him because he grew up in Minnesota, where we lived many years, in the Twin Cities. And if nothing else, Tom Friedman has a way of turning a phrase. And he wrote a book, and he entitled it, "Thanks for Being Late." He lives in Washington, D.C., in the northern suburbs of Bethesda or somewhere, but his office was in downtown Washington, and he would commute into the city to his office. And often he would try to set up breakfast appointments of people he wanted to visit with. And invariably, they would get there late. And hence the title of this book, Thanks for Being Late, because he was able to think a little bit. But the gist of the book, he goes back and he looks at the community, St. Louis Park, Minnesota, where he grew up, and he comes out here, visits with the people at Intel and others, and some other places, and he's looking at this issue of what technology has done in terms of the rate of change and the speed of it. And our institutions, our social life is not often able to adjust nearly as quickly as the technology. And those of us, most of us here, of certain age, we understand that. We can be in touch with anybody, anywhere in the world, anytime. Okay. There are those, we'll finish up here, there are those who will say the real problem, the basic problem in our culture and society is basically religion. If it goes away, if it were to go away, we'd all be better off. And then you don't have to go back very far, and there was the thought that as countries and places and peoples and societies modernize, religion will just wither away. It's myth and fabrication, and it contributes little or nothing. Well, places in the world have modernized. Religion hasn't gone away. Don't hold your breath if that's what you want to have happen. The 20th century, by any objective measure, was the most violent century in human history, often driven by technology and so on and so forth. The great conflicts and wars of the 20th century were not religious wars. Nationalism, Marxist-Leninism, National Socialism. I have no idea how many millions of people lost their lives or were disrupted in World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and all the little sub-wars around. Religion is here to stay. It has not and will not wither away in the face of modernity, as some have predicted. The human impulse to find meaning and a way to live beyond the mundane is just too great. Rather, the question before us now and always is, how will religion help us as people responsibly serve and interact with the societies in which we live here and now? I can find no better place to begin these kinds of reflections for people in our tradition than the words of Jesus. Quote, and one of the lawyers asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Next week, we turn our attention specifically to Tim Alberta's book. Today was kind of an introduction and thinking about these issues of extremism more broadly in the world and across religious divides. Any final comment or question? Yes.
I can't confirm this, but I've heard that in some of these more extremist groups, sometimes they enforce like much more restrictive rules on what you can wear and what you can dress.
Yes. In some of these extremist groups, they have restrictions on what you can wear, how you can behave, and so on. The social cohesion and expectation, often led by a charismatic leader or culture, that's exactly right. And you see that, I mean, going back to the 16th century and before, but in the 20th century, even if you don't dress differently, the social cohesion seeps into what you think, how you operate, and behave. No question about it. Thanks for coming. Appreciate your time.